So the concept is that this guy, he wakes up in hell and he's like, oh, I'm in hell. That's not fair. But I was a faithful Mormon. I shouldn't be in hell. There must be some kind of mistake. And the officiant, the bureaucratic demon who's supposed to assign him to his particular hell, the hell that he's the most suited for, is like, listen, lots of people have their reaction. I'm sure you were a perfectly great guy. However, unfortunately, you believed in the wrong god. The correct answer was Zoroastrianism. I know a lot of people are really upset. A lot of people are going to take this pretty hard. But the correct god is actually the Zoroastrian god. And he's like, what? I don't know. Oh. And then the demon assigns him to his hell. And the hell is the infinite library. Here's the idea, right? It's explained in a lot of detail in the Borges short story, and then in a bit less detail here. The short story is that there is a library, and this library contains every possible combination of book. And the books are of a very particular format, right? They are 410 pages long. They have, I think, 80 lines per page and 40 characters per line, something like that. There's some number, right? And so the idea is, it's a relatively large book. It's a book-sized book. And the characters are determined completely at random. But the library is large enough that it contains every possible combination of characters for a book of that length. Which means it also contains everything that could possibly be conveyed by those combinations of characters, i.e., every book that can or could ever be written within those constraints. And actually, there's like some clever tricks you can do. Clever tricks that the library does, I suppose, that get around those constraints as well. Like somebody points out, actually, that a book that is fewer than 410 pages long could simply be written in several editions. And since the library contains every possible book, it contains, it will necessarily contain the corresponding edition. The corresponding volume for a multi-volume work. They just won't necessarily be shelved together. Which is a clever workaround, and it's an interesting way to say that every work of any size, every work of any size, is contained within the library. Although I suppose that's not true. The only work that couldn't be contained would be, oh man, I don't know. I'm not good enough at math to work this out. But I suppose it is possible to imagine a work that is longer than the entire length of the library, but it would have to be circular, if that makes sense. It would necessarily need to be, because the library contains every possible book of that length, even if you printed it in multiple editions, you would necessarily have to conceive of a story in which everything that possibly could be said has been said, and then the work would have to be longer than that by going in circles or something. Which gives you an idea, actually, of just how, like, I think that is an idea that helps me to understand just how many like books we're talking about here, right? Is that a story, like, it's weird, right? Because you could just imagine an infinite story, but of course there's not an infinite permutation of things that could be said, and so no matter how like infinite your story is, it's nonetheless contained within the library by dint of the fact that it's a sayable story at all. Okay, there are a couple of. I think the thing that's tough about this book, and that makes me actually admire it quite a bit, is that it's caught in an interesting circumstance, right? Which is that the original Borges short story it reads like a Wikipedia article. There's not really any plot of any kind. And I've read this story pretty closely because it's just interesting to me for the fact that it is extremely compelling as a short story without having any of the things that would traditionally make for a quality narrative. Like there's no story, there's no events, there's barely any characters, like, and so on. And A Short Stay in Hell wants us to. It gives us characters, it gives us plot, it gives us stuff. And it also frames the library as a punishment. That's one thing that is a really interesting change, is that the Borges story views the library as a sort of interesting possibility, right? Whereas A Short Stay in Hell reframes the library as a punishment. These people are in hell, and this library is that hell. Which is an interesting reframing. I don't quite know what to make of it. Like, I wish I had read this book with somebody so that I could be like talking to them about it. Okay, but anyway, so this guy goes to hell, and this process is explained to him that like you're in this infinite, nearly infinite library, and the way that you get out of hell is you need to locate the book that tells perfect, with complete accuracy and with no grammatical mistakes or anything like that, no omissions, that tells your entire life story. And yeah, I think I think some of you will have already figured out how fucking long that is going to take. You've got a library that contains every story that could ever possibly have been told, and you've got to find a particular book. And it gets worse, right? It gets worse. Like, they spend a lot of time in the story figuring out how bad it is, and they never really fully get to the meat of how bad it is. The story doesn't really conclude this thought. It starts the thought, it mulls over it plenty, but there's never any like grand conclusion, right? So the situation is oh yeah, so you've probably already figured out how like just fucking impossible the thing that they've been asked to do is. The characters don't figure it out for a really long time. They are blessedly innocent of these things. And yeah, they go to hell, and they have these rules explained. There's other people in hell. This guy's not alone, and he says the people are like, "Damn, that's crazy. You know, that'll take so long. We're talking like 2, 3, maybe as many as like 20 years looking for this book." And buddy, oh buddy, that does not scratch the surface. Like, Jesus. And so these characters are like, man, this is such a bummer. You know, I'm gonna be here for probably like years. You know, and of course, like, you know, they're going to be there for trillions of years. Like, the task that has been set before them requires, you know, more time than than it will take for the entire observable universe to destroy itself 100 times over. Like, they have been given, and this is what is meant by the words almost infinite, is that the of course it's not infinite, and in falling short of infinity, it is infinitely not infinite. It is infinitely far away from being infinite. However, from a human time scale, these things are not like it's not. It doesn't mean anything that they're different. Like, you cannot fully conceive of how much time this is going to take. One time in high school, this teacher said a really weird thing to me, where he came up to me and he was just like, he just wanted to describe how long eternity was. He said this is what he told his kids when they were misbehaving. He said every 100 years, a bird flies by a golden ball that is spinning, that is the size of the earth, and it flaps its wing at the ball in the opposite direction of the way that it's spinning so that it slows down a little bit. Every 100 years, a bird does that. And in the time it would take for 100 of those golden balls to completely stop spinning, that is just the beginning of eternity. And I feel, first of all, very weird thing to say to a child. I was raised an atheist, so when he said that, I was like, why is that something that would make your children stop misbehaving? I don't understand. Like, eternity is a really long time. That's the definition. Why would that make them like want to do the dishes? And he had to explain to me like, no, no, no. I'm threatening to torture them. I'm through my proxy god. I'm threatening to torture my children. So that was a really weird conversation. But anyway, I feel like this story is one of those little thought experiments that is designed to, you know, make you think about how long eternity is. Because, of course, you know, any explanation that we give for how long eternity would be falls short. It falls infinitely short. However, you don't actually have to even approximate infinity to get to a point where the human mind, it like stops being able to conceive of how close to infinity we are. And this story is there. And the main character does some crazy things that really give us a hint of how infinite this infinity is. At the beginning, he gives us some concepts of his positionality relative to these stories, the story happening. So for people who don't like think about stories all the time, the default way of telling a story, I don't know if it's the default, but like it's very common. It taps into a lot of like common sense about the way that stories get told. Is something that is called retrospective perspective, or I forget what the actual name is. I'd sound way cooler and smarter if I did remember what the name is. But it's essentially when you are looking back. So it's past tense, first person, and you're looking back on events that have occurred to you, and you're like kind of thinking about those events. This is the perspective that like most Russian literature that I've read is told in. These events have occurred, and we are from some maybe revealed, maybe not revealed point in the future. We are thinking back on those events, and they sometimes include reflections, and this is a really great perspective for this story because part of the question that bugs us is like how far into the future is this recollection? You know, the guy that's telling us the story, how many billions of years old is he? And we never really get a straight answer. We do get some really sad details. First of all, the book is framed as one which the character found. The character located this book that tells, unfortunately, not their life story, but their story, their death story. But he even says there's actually some changes, and those changes are extremely minuscule, uh, but they exist. So even though this already isn't his life story, he still has found only an imperfect copy, right? And it'll take him presumably billions of times longer to find the actual true story of what happened to him in the afterlife, let alone the actual true story of what happened to him on Earth. And I don't know, that just it just like I mean, this story is like a fractal, you know. Everything that you look at is a microcosm of the sort of point that the rest of the story is getting at. I think that this story also does a really good job of adding some like human dimensions to the infinite. So first of all, the first we kind of zoom out as time goes on, and we get a very detailed version of the first couple of weeks, first couple of months, first couple of years of his time in this hell. And one thing that happens to him is that his sense of like things that he previously would have considered extremely crucial to his morality, those things go away. So, for instance, he's a Mormon, so there's certain like foods that he has never eaten before that he's like, oh man, that's crazy. I'm eating these foods. He has like coffee for the first time. Crazy. I couldn't be a Mormon. He has coffee for the first time, and he's like, wow, that shit is gross. Um, Oh, by the way, they have food. Yeah, there's like a food dispenser. You can ask for whatever type of food you want. No tricking the food by saying no tricking the food dispenser by saying like I'd like to have a high powered jet engine for lunch, please. But anything that can be eaten, you can ask for it from the food dispenser. And I don't know, this opens up some like interesting but ultimately kind of like beside the point possibilities that the story explores a little bit, but thankfully doesn't explore that much. So like for instance, to order. Uh, People are basically able to acquire bones, and they learn like a sort of primitive, like they make instruments and weapons out of these things. And yeah, okay. Anyway, so then he at some point he drinks alcohol for the first time, and that he really doesn't like. He's like, okay, I understand. I understand actually why God said we shouldn't drink alcohol. It's become very clear to me. And he freaks out, and he turns and he runs in one direction, and he runs for 3 weeks. Right? He runs day and night for 3 weeks, and he does not. First of all, he doesn't see anyone, and second of all, he doesn't like find the end of the library, which like you know, by the end of the story, or like if you have figured out just how big if you have an approximation in your head of how big the library is, this doesn't like feel. It feels cute to say like, oh, I ran for 3 weeks and I never found the end of the library. But I think that it actually does a really good job of like anchoring us in human scale, because if you found an environment, let alone like a library, and you ran through it at top speed for 21 days and you didn't see the end of it, that would be insane. That would be crazy. Like, that would drive me insane. So I think that it's good that we start with that relatively small sense of like, man, this place is huge. Before we jump into the other stuff that's like, ugh. Um, okay, great. So then we jump forward like 100 years, and by the way, he starts some relationships. Always straight relationships. This guy doesn't seem to experiment with his sexuality even in hell. But he starts these relationships, and he says that he sort of like he feels bad about them because he has a wife, and he feels like he's cheating on her in hell, and like maybe this is like part of God's test, to see for him to get into heaven. It's like, will you cheat on your wife? And he does, although he nor anybody else doesn't really consider it cheating because like we're all dead, whatever. Then after like 100 years, he they found this university. Everybody has a perfect memory in this hell, which is quite useful when people come together. They can like learn new things. And this is the part where like afterwards, I was really thinking about this part. Like it's really good that the author didn't linger on the stuff that I thought about, but I was like, well, if you have infinite memory, then you actually have access to the collective knowledge of all of the people that go to this hell, which is presumably quite a valuable thing. So you could learn some very like interesting and useful stuff, and you could also like you could basically like invent technology that is rooted in materials that can be scavenged from edible materials that can be. It's just totally a direction that the story thankfully doesn't actually go in, but that's just what was in my brain while I was reading. I was very like distracted by the fact that you could actually accomplish quite a lot with a group of people that have perfect memories over their lifetimes, and also you can synthesize new like a priori information, and you know you could do not exactly observational science, but you could listen to what people had experienced in their lives and use that to like synthesize new. Okay, yeah. Anyway, that's that's the way my brain works, but thankfully it's not the way this author's brain works. So anyway, there's the university, and it's been 100 years, and at the end of every year, they come together and they read the most intelligent, most coherent book that has been found. And what they have found, the most intelligent and coherent book that they have found after 100 years, is a book of complete nonsense that has two consecutive sentences that are grammatically, they make sense. And one could even imagine a context where they make more sense. And that's the best that they found after 100 years. And the main character, of course, finds this like extremely demotivating. uh, oh, and then what happens is that he leaves his partner of 2 years so that he can be with this woman named Rachel, who he met at the university. He explicitly says after he starts this relationship with Rachel that she is his soulmate. So that's really nice. Lil bro finds his soulmate in hell, and then he loses her again after a while. And a lot of the rest of the story is about the sort of like pain of losing his soulmate. What happens is they end up in like a tough situation where some people are threatening to like torture them. You can experience pain in hell, by the way. You when you die, you come back to life. So sometimes people will like murder each other or murder themselves, stuff like that. Um, and Rachel responds to this situation by jumping over the railing and like falling through the library. And he is not able to follow her until like a month later. And by that point, she could be anywhere. She has been falling for a month. She reached terminal velocity pretty quickly, and then has been falling for up to 1 month. Like, she's gone, bro. You're not finding her again. And yeah, and a lot of the rest of the book is about that feeling of like having found his soulmate and then not being able to find her again, and going very very far away via this route of like jumping off the railing and falling, but not really reaching anywhere. Somebody calculates the distance to the bottom of the library, and it's measured in light years. So like even if you jumped off the railing and you fell for a really really long time, you would not hit the bottom in it would take you a very long time. I don't know how long it would take you, but it would be like tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of years of just falling. So yeah, and that's the system by which he gets like separated from people. The last thing that happens, it's a very like it's a very like heterosexual. It's surprisingly like heterosexual as a book. It's very oriented towards heterosexual romantic slash sexual relationships. Uh, that seems to be like the only place that this guy finds momentary, albeit usually like minor and always temporary, reprieve from the pressures of hell. So he falls through the library for a really long time. He eventually figures out a way to stop his fall, so that he can fall and like, but not, it's not very organized. You basically like crash land onto a floor, and you crash land going at terminal velocity, so you know die, and then you wake up the next day and you're alive and you're on whatever floor you ended up at. So he does this for long enough that he no longer encounters. He's like has stopped encountering people, and then he sees someone falling, right, and he jumps after them. Turns out to be a woman, and he's like, hell yeah, another relationship. So they have the majority of their relationship happens while they're falling, which is kind of fun. It's weird. They just hang out while they're like falling through this library, and then eventually they're like, okay, we'd like to stop falling, and so they try to coordinate, crash landing on one of the floors at the same time. It doesn't work out. They get separated yet again, and that's sort of the note that the book ends off on, which I find really interesting because he finds his soulmate and then loses her, and oh no, I lost my soulmate isn't the end of the book. The book continues, and this is what I mean when I say that it's like trying to give us this human aspect of this like infinity. Um, the book continues to the point where the main character is no longer concerned about finding his soulmate. It continues to the point where he finds anyone, just like a random woman. And by the way, they start having sex like almost immediately. Like they meet each other and they're like, sex time, let's go. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that gives you an image of like what this space has done to people. It's that like any amount of human connection is automatically for both of them. It's like you're the greatest person in the world, even though it's literally just some woman, and he is, from her perspective, literally just some man. Like this question of like being the ideal person is so far in the rearview mirror that this guy doesn't even reflect on that. Like he doesn't even think about uh, what this new type of relationship means for for him having found his soulmate and then having lost her again. And yeah, the book just keeps doing that, where the progression of time, like there's so much of it that it renders everything, everything that has happened before is rendered meaningless, and the character just doesn't fucking care anymore. Eventually, and the thing is, like, all throughout the book, so the events that happen in a like 1,000-year frame, and then the last, as we're like zooming way out, we get some glimpses of what it means for him to have spent more than 1,000 years. But beyond that point, we do get the sense that this guy's subjectivity stops really being exactly human and starts being more like something that resembles human. Like he can talk to us, he can explain things to us, but he has experienced a level of an amount of time that has rendered him like beyond the scope of what, like he's like some sort of like transformed creature now, in the same way that a vampire is something that used to be human, a werewolf is something that used to be human, and in some ways resembles a human being. He has undergone like a similar transformation, and by the end of the book, I really do get the sense that if he found Rachel, if he found his soulmate again, it wouldn't even necessarily be cause for rejoicing on his part. It would just be like, oh, there's a lot of things to run into in this library. I guess sooner or later we were going to run into each other. And the other thing is that the infinite memory thing also, like the fact that they all have infinite memories, eventually renders the actual like presence of the other person kind of unnecessary, which is dour. He says that, and after the 1,000-year like time skip, he no longer mentions like specific people, but he says that from time to time it would take a really really long time. It would be eons. It would be an amount of time that if I called it infinity, you've got the right idea of how long it took. It would be that amount of time before he ran into someone again, and then he would stick with them. He would travel with them. They would talk for a long time, but eventually you just run out of things to say. You've said everything there is to say, and both of you remember those conversations with perfect detail. And so the actual presence of that person is no longer necessary. Like they have been fully experienced, and now you can just, you know, not be near them anymore. So yeah, very dour story. One thing, man, there's like, oh, the thing is during the part of the story where we are like moored in time, where we know how much time has passed, he never finds a book that is even slightly meaningful, which I think does a really really good job of anchoring us and giving us like an idea. We can imagine just how unimaginable the amount of time that has passed is, because the most meaningful thing that they ever find is like two sentences. It's like, okay, well, how long must it have taken for him to have found the book that we are currently reading? Must have taken forever. And yeah, I don't know, quite a disturbing image. It's one that has definitely stayed with me, and I don't quite know what to make of it. And it's also just like it has given me such a craving to discuss with other people. One area where the book sort of opens itself up, there's a bit of instructions that they receive at the beginning. First of all, there's kind of a joke that I found pretty funny, which was for those of you wanting to learn more about Zoroastrianism, the one true religion that you didn't believe in, and that's why you're in hell. For those of you who want to learn more about Zoroastrianism, by special arrangement, there's one book on Zoroastrianism on every single floor. And of course, the floors are not infinite, but we certainly never see the end of them. I think the image of the library is supposed to be like a square, right? You've got a square, and you've got two rows, and the rows are separated by this big gap, and you can sort of jump down the gap. So I was initially imagining something that I think I wasn't supposed to be imagining, which is a library in 3 dimensions where you can go anywhere you want. No, it's like 2 dimensions, and there's up, down, left, and right, and that's it. So of course the floors are like very nearly infinite, just like everything else in the library. And also the the characters would have no way of knowing if, like, even if you do find a book that appears to relay factual information, you have no way of like verifying that factual information. The only thing that a book can do for you here is to put thoughts in your head, and there's no way of knowing if those thoughts have a correspondence to reality. The other thing is, like, it's not clear in most cases if that would actually matter. Like, I guess the thing is just that, like, there's no guarantee that any book that you have has a correspondence to reality. And as a matter of fact, there's kind of the opposite. There is a guarantee that any of those relationships are purely coincidental. So that's what makes this like one book of Zoroastrianism on every floor kind of funny, because it's like, okay, there's one book about Zoroastrianism on every floor. There are also presumably many, many books that appear to be about Zoroastrianism, but then that like just say other stuff, grammatically coherent but not correct. And there's no technique for there's like no way suggested for distinguishing between one and the other. Like the only way that you could distinguish is to ask a Zoroastrianism, and that's the one type of person that's not in hell. So I don't know. I find that this joke, it keeps on giving. The more you think about it, the more goofy it is. Actually, I said there's one type of person that's not in hell. There's actually another thing about hell that I wasn't able to figure it out, but it's such a random detail. It's like definitely not there by accident, which is that the only type of person in hell, in this hell anyway, are white Americans. Every single person that this guy meets is a white American, and he says the one suggestion about why this might be is that perhaps it's like part of the punishment is that there's no variety in hell. You're no longer going to encounter like people who are that different from you, which is interesting. There's never any like suggestion that any of these people are even multilingual. So I guess if you know a second language, you're out. You can't go to this hell, which is pretty funny. I mean, I suspect part of the reason that was done is there's got to be some sort of thematic point that I'm not seeing to this thing, that there's only like white Anglo-Saxon monolingual Americans in hell. Hell is like Utah, Hell, yeah. But anyway, I also suspect that part of the reason for that is that The writer just didn't really want to have to consider the implications of what this library would mean for people who speak like various different languages. It's discussed at one time or another that any language that is represented by the same characters that English is represented by, presumably there are a lot of those books in the library, and it would be, I don't know, extremely weird to come across a book that's in like Croatian or something, and you don't speak Croatian, and nobody in this hell speaks anything but English. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I think the writer just didn't really want to unpack it, which is part of the reason that there's only white monolingual Americans in hell. But yeah, I wasn't able to figure out like the thematic reason behind that, and it's clear that there is one. Otherwise, this wouldn't be a detail that is like lingered on for so long. The other thing that I think is worth discussing is what the like point of hell is. Early on, the demon that explains hell to them is like, listen, you know, he actually gets into this argument with like I think a Southern Baptist, where the Southern Baptist is like, this is so unreasonable, you know, how could you blah blah blah, and the demon is like, are you kidding me? Like, our hells, first of all, our hells are infinitely more humane than the hells that your worldview would have imposed on everybody else. You know, all of those, you know, Chinese people who had never heard about Jesus, who you were going to send to hell. Weird example. That's the example that the book uses. The Chinese, they've heard about Jesus. um, but anyway, all of those Chinese people that you were going to send to hell for eternity, first of all, rest assured they're in hell too, because they weren't Zoroastrians either. But you know, they, in your worldview, were going to go to hell forever. In our, you know, correct worldview, hell is not forever. It's merely for a very, very long time. So you'll be fine. You know, you'll get out of hell in a jiffy, and then you'll be fine. And so when they go to hell, apparently in the Zoroastrian worldview, which I still haven't bothered looking into, maybe I should because it turns out they're the one true religion. But in the Zoroastrian worldview, hell is not forever. It's sort of more like a very, very, very unpleasant purgatory where you're there to learn some sort of lesson, and then you get to go to heaven. So in their instructions, when they arrive in hell, it's explained to them, you're here to learn some sort of lesson. Don't bother trying to figure out what it is. That will make things take longer. It'll only have you frustrated. And you know, that's such a promising and like interesting line, but I also wasn't able to figure out what the lesson was. What, like, it's such a like you must interpret, and here's the theme. Go ahead and think about it. Type of line, and then there was like, I don't know. I wasn't really able to figure out what it is that they could possibly be learning, what it is that they need to learn in order to enter heaven, except for quite possibly everything that could ever possibly be taught, because that's what's in the library, and they're gonna have to go through statistically about half of that material before they get to go to heaven. So, oh, and there's another layer of this, like, how long is it going to take me to leave hell thing that is never fully explored. It's mentioned and then not like elaborated on, which is okay, I need to find a book that says my life story, but in what level of detail? Right? Because the books are like 410 pages long. Do I need to find the 410 page long book that says my life story to the closest level of detail possible? Or do I need to find a multi volume set that says my entire life story in the greatest detail possible with all, you know, words? And this is the thing that people are like, yeah, interesting point. And then they just kind of move on. And so the question is, like, somebody fundamentally undermines, like, what are we even looking for here? How would you even know it when you see it? Like, what are we trying to find? And everybody kind of acknowledges that they don't know what they're looking for, and then they just get on with it forever. so yeah, that's, I don't know. It's another area where like the book sort of hints at the nearly infinite nature of the worlds that they found themselves in, how just like mind-bogglingly large the task ahead of them is, and then everybody's just like, I don't know, get to it, buddy. Turn into like a shade from Greek mythology. No feelings, no thoughts, no nothing, no care for the human world. Can't even imagine having an emotion anymore, and then stay that way for several trillion years, and then maybe you'll have an answer to your question. Um, I also just keep thinking about like in this hell statistically improbable events that are like nonetheless like possible within the framework of what they're looking at here, which is like for instance someone who shows up in hell and is like, okay, I'm gonna look for the book that has my whole life story, and then they pick up a book and the very first one is like their whole life story. Or the equally likely person who the very last, like they read every book in hell, and the very last book that they find is the one that they're looking for, and they're like, okay, that's great, I've read every single book in hell. Or the possibility of someone who like the very first book that they pick up, like one thing that I thought of is like if you're looking for a book, 410 pages, there are presumably many, 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 many books that are a completely accurate portrayal of your life up until the 410th page where they revert to just being total nonsense. And just thinking about like the fact that not only is that a possibility, but for the people who are getting out of hell, that is, I suppose, an inevitability that they'll pick up a book and they'll be like, "Oh my god, this is it," and then they read it to the last page, and the last page is just like just a bunch of key smashes, and it's like, okay, great, and like those books outnumber the one true book by like a very very large factor. So you would presumably be running into a lot of those for every one book for presumably most people, almost everyone, would run into one of those books at least once in the search for like their true book. The other thing is just like, I suppose if you imagine that what's happening is that any book that makes sense, people actually read. Everyone by the end of this is going to have read like not just every book, but like half of all possible books, and that probably means half of all possible books probably means effectively the entirety of all meaningful books. Because, for example, like if I imagine Shakespeare, right? Let's say Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet is a text that makes sense within the context of the library. And I can imagine a version of Romeo and Juliet that's written to have just the text of Romeo and Juliet, and then after that text is finished, it's just a bunch of blank pages, right? That's exactly one book in the library, and anyone searching through the library for their one book, it has a 50-50 chance of encountering that book. Now let's say that I take that book and I one by one alter individual characters, like not people, but like characters in the entire book, and those are spread out throughout the library. There is now like a huge, like a several thousand copies of what you could pick up and read and be like understanding the message of Romeo and Juliet, right? And let's just say there's like 100,000 of those, okay, right? And a person in the course of finding their one book is going to encounter half of those. So when we consider what an infinitesimally small uh, portion of all possible books are actually like meaningful and make sense, and how minor alterations to those books can still convey the exact same message, what we're looking at is a situation where everyone, by the time they find their one book, will most likely have read every single meaningful book that could be written ever. And sure, they might have read it with like one typo in it, or like one page that's a little weird, or like some letters superimposed, or something like that. But people are presumably capable of reading past that, so they will read, you know, not just every meaningful book, but they'll read every meaningful book with approximately 50% of all possible typos in that book. You will not just encounter Romeo and Juliet, you will encounter 50% of all possible versions of books that you could look at and say, oh, that's basically Romeo and Juliet, but there's like a little typo here. You'll encounter half of those. Statistically, you'll encounter about half of them before you get to the end of your journey. Um, if you're one of the lucky ones who only ends up reading, 1% only ends up having to flip through 1% of the library before they find their book, you're still going to be encountering pretty much every meaningful book, because there's like way more than 100 possible typos in War and Peace that nonetheless leave the book readable. Um, yeah. Okay, there's like, I don't know, there's just like so many ways to slice this nearly infinite cake. You can see why this is a fun story, right? And if you've watched this entire video, you've now invested approximately 1/4 of the time that it would have taken you to read the entire novel. I honestly recommend doing basically what I did, which is first off read the Borges story. Read it in a group, read it with other people. It's so much fun to discuss. I assigned the Borges story as a short story for high school, and I really caught my high schoolers some of their attentions when I showed them. There's like a fan library that the it's a website, and the website contains, in theory, it's a system for generating addresses to any arbitrarily written book within the parameters that Borges describes. So 410 pages, this many lines, this many characters per line, blah blah blah. Which means it is, in theory, a digital library that contains every possible book within those parameters. So I showed it to my students, and I was like, "This book, this website contains a page somewhere that will tell you an accurate account of your entire life, including the parts that haven't happened yet." And I swear to God, like, teaching high schoolers are so good at being bored, because like 90% of the room, like all but one of the students was just like, okay. I could come into class and I could tell them that there was a new scientific discovery, that the moon is full of alligators and the sun is full of penguins, and that the penguins flapping together, they generate enough heat. That's where sunlight comes from, and that's where the heat comes from in our universe. And they would like barely wake up to register that information. But anyway, there was one student who was like, "Oh my God, really, Mr. Morgan?" And I kind of resisted the temptation to immediately be like, "No, not really." Like, it's this website, gestures at that idea, but it doesn't actually do that. But the thing is, it does actually do that. Like, that website does, as a matter of fact, have a page on it somewhere that accurately describes the life story of that student up to the point of their death. Uh, it's just a question of like actually finding that page, which, like, I can't do, they can't do. We'll only be able to find it once that information has been revealed to us. But anyway, so I recommend reading the short story, the Borges short story. It's called The Library of Babel, and it's really, really good. It's really fun to discuss. So, like, discuss it with somebody. And then a little while later, this is exactly what I did. I recommend reading this novella, because this novella, um, it's not quite as mathematical, right? The Borges story is very mathematical. The Borges story is very interested in the sort of strange implications of the library, right? It doesn't have a lot of narrative, but it's like the Library of Babel has ideas in it that are like, what does it mean that this library contains true biographies of the archangels? The short story is interested in those kinds of questions, which are very interesting questions. However, they are not, they're very abstract, And this novel takes that impossible, weird space, and it says, okay, but what if you were a guy? What if you were some dude, right? What if you were just some jabroni who just showed up, and you're not in some alternate dimension, you're not some weird librarian for whom all of the stuff just intuitively makes sense, and this is just what the world is. What if you were just like, Greg from accounting, and suddenly you were in the Library of Babel, and you had to find the Book of Greg. So yeah, it's great. God, I can't stop rambling about this shit. But unfortunately, unlike the Library of Babel, this video is not allowed to be nearly infinite. That violates YouTube's terms of service. They don't allow for nearly infinite videos. So I do have to find a way to land this plane eventually. Oh, okay. Anyway, as you can tell, I love talking about this story. If you have any, I don't know, thoughts, please write them in the comments. I will maybe respond to them. I don't respond to all comments, but I do read every comment you write, especially the rude ones. The rude ones, I read them and then I think about them and then I cry a little bit. So yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts, if you have something you can do to explain this fucking inscrutable short story or novella, this inscrutable novella, I don't know. Please let me know. It's just so. Ugh. Okay. Anyway, that's all for now. Bye bye.